All right, guys, as we finish up here with the New Deal, just a couple of things to talk about here. First, the New Deal in the West, dams and water control, big deal. Now, again, there was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which did the same thing, provided massive amount of dams and flood control, but also electricity, and that, of course, was in the Tennessee Valley. This is different. Of course, it's same in terms of providing water control and flood control and electricity, but totally different part of the country, and really provided for what would eventually lead to the major expansion of the West, particularly California. You had many dams built in the West, and again, dams are so important. Obviously, they provide a lot of jobs and long term. It's not just like a week or so. I mean, talking several years. Flood control, water for growing cities. Now, this has become more of an issue for San Diego, especially as Phoenix starts to grow. Well, starts to grow. I guess they're bigger than San Diego now, but as we move up to this point, certainly Phoenix was a smaller city, and now it's a huge city, and all the other areas in Arizona. Nevada's cities in Nevada are growing, and that means less water available. And so this has actually become an issue somewhat, water for growing cities. And of course, water for crops. And if you're unaware, there are massive amounts of agricultural things in California. The San Joaquin Valley is one of the richest places to grow all sorts of crops. And there we go again, generating electricity. And so dams were very important for these things, these reasons, in the West. Also, Native Americans got a new deal. A guy named John Collier was the new head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And under his leadership, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, and this provided an end to forced assimilation. I guess better late than never, but of course, the practice of forced assimilation was really one of the worst policies that we've had. Restored Indian lands to tribal ownership. If you remember a long time ago, the Dawes Act, it broke up individual Native American lands, or broke up the reservations and provided individual private ownership to Native Americans, which is in many cases not something that Native Americans were seeking. And also gave federal recognition to Indian tribes as sovereign governments. Sovereign meaning that they control their own business, and they don't have to answer to the United States. They're their own country. And I say for the most part, the biggest thing we know is Native American gaming. There are restrictions on that, and how a foreign country, which is what the United States would be if Native Americans truly are sovereign, how a foreign country like the United States, in reference to the Indians, the Native Americans, how they could tell another country what to do and what laws they can have with their gambling. To me, that's unbelievably bizarre. So this idea of the Native Americans being completely sovereign is just simply not true. New Deal in the South. Well, there's the Tennessee Valley Authority. Times were tough in the South, and in part that led to the establishment of the TVA. Why were times tough in the South? Well, you had very low income levels, very little land ownership, and poor education. Well, the TVA was not going to solve all of that, but what it did do: hydroelectric power, controls flooding, and then also restored farming areas that were damaged by overuse. Now, it wasn't necessarily Dust Bowl areas, but there were still, poor farming practices that leached the soil of their nutrients. And also, one thing: eliminate malaria. Now, usually malaria is not something you'd really associate with the United States, but in these areas, they were just not very industrialized, and really was somewhat, years behind the rest of the country. The bad thing about the TVA: it did provide jobs, economic relief, all the things that we see, right here. But the TVA was very damaging from an environmental standpoint. But then back then, the environment was not a major factor. People were not very concerned about damage to the environment at that time. There were some, of course, as we know about the preservation of natural spaces and things like that, but it was nowhere near to the extent that it is today. And finally, with mass media and popular culture, radio was the lifeline, almost like our smartphones are today. The radio, even though it had already been invented, really began to become increasingly ubiquitous. There's another nice fancy word. It means that it's everywhere. Um, Even in the Depression, and this shows you how important it was, where people don't have a lot of expendable income. Even in the Depression, 1937, Americans purchased 28 radios a minute. Families listen for 5 hours a day. So I know when parents say, "Oh, you're on the computer forever." Well, back then you guys were on the radio forever. People began to listen to shows like news reports. And believe it or not, soap operas got their start on the radio. Adventure stories, comedies, and a lot of sports. And I'm sure some of us still listen to baseball on the radio. I know that I do when I'm in the car. Just put the radio on and see how our Padres. The one, or not the one of the great things about the radio is it helped create a more homogenous society because the radio was providing shared experiences. I mean, everyone was listening to the same thing, and those are a shared experience. Movies, another form of diversion. They were inexpensive. They offered an escape from the very harsh realities. And again, here's that same thing: unified the country through shared experiences. That's you look at what creates a culture, and what unifies a culture. A lot of it comes down to shared experiences. It also was uplifting, and what I mean by that is that usually the movies, at least at this time, typically carried a message that emphasized good over evil, and gave a little hope to the people. All right. Thank you so much.